In this video, I'm going to talk about appropriations and fiscal law. We're going to talk about the constitutional requirement for appropriations. We'll define what they are and give examples of various types. And then we'll turn to an overview of fiscal law concepts, key legal boundaries that surround these appropriations, and some critical terminology to understand how they work. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution of the United States says that no money shall leave the Treasury but in consequence of an appropriation made by law. So the only way that we government officials can spend money is if one of these appropriations exist. And the way an appropriation exists is that a law is passed. So what is an appropriation? Well, it's a law that Congress passes that specifically authorizes someone in the federal government, they could be in any branch of the government, to enter into financial obligations that will result in a payment immediately or sometime in the future from the Treasury. The word comes from the Latin, a Latin term meaning to set aside or to make one's own. So we have these funds that are designated to a particular use to the exclusion of all other uses. And there are various types of appropriations. There are the regular annual appropriations that we look for by the 1st of October of each year, the beginning of the fiscal year. There are 12 of these regular annual appropriations that fund the discretionary portion of the federal budget. There are permanent appropriations that fund the mandatory spending programs. Congress does not write a new appropriation every year, say, for Social Security. There is a permanent appropriation that if you are eligible for Social Security benefits, that the checks can be written without an annual congressional appropriation. There are supplemental appropriations. There are times when the federal budget is insufficient to cover the costs of something. Imagine a war breaks out. Imagine a natural disaster. Those are things that are usually unanticipated in the budget, and the appropriate executive agencies can go to Congress and request supplemental funding, a supplemental appropriation. Last is a continuing appropriation. Should the regular Appropriation Act not be passed by the beginning of the fiscal year, we often see Congress pass what we call a continuing resolution authority, or more appropriately, it's a continuing appropriation. A continuing appropriation should be viewed as a continuation of the prior fiscal year and not as a down payment on the new fiscal year. There are strict restrictions as to what can be done under a continuing resolution. That's a little outside the scope of this video. So on the screen is a sample Appropriation Act. This is from the 2017 Department of Defense Appropriations. And notice it says Title I Military Personnel. The Appropriation Act for the Department of Defense is broken down into multiple titles: military personnel, operation and maintenance, procurement, research development, test and evaluation, and so on. What we commonly call separate appropriations, that O&M is a different appropriation from R&D, isn't quite correct. They're simply different titles underneath a single Appropriation Act. And you can see in this language, it explains what can be bought, what the government can spend money on in each of these categories. Under military personnel, Army, pay, benefits, PCS moves, those sorts of things. Military pay, Navy, similar types of categories, but we cannot use the Army money for the Navy. And we'll talk more about this purpose limitation in a few minutes. Budget authority. Right? I said that an appropriation provides the authority for an official of the government to bind the government or oblige the government, and we call that budget authority. When an appropriation is passed, what does not happen is that the Treasurer of the United States does not go over to the Pentagon with a bag full of money and say, here you go, Secretary of Defense, here's the money that you can spend this year. It doesn't work like that at all. What we have is legal permission to bind the government. And once the government is bound to pay for goods or services received, only then will money move out of the Treasury to satisfy those obligations. This permission is a positive authority. So the rule is you can spend no money unless there is an appropriation that permits that. The rule is not I can spend whatever I want unless there's a rule that says no. Okay? So we must ensure that there is an appropriation there for the thing we wish to spend money on. All right, so the Constitution gives Congress this power to appropriate. Additionally, for us in the military, the Constitution also gives Congress significant power over the military to raise and support armies, provide and maintain a navy, make the rules that govern the land and naval forces, on and on. So in combination, these appropriations limit what the Department of Defense can do, the time period during which they can do that, and the scope of that effort. And that's done through the language of the appropriation bill, and in some respects the authorization bill, on these three dimensions: the purpose for which you receive the money, the time period during which it's available, and the amount that you have available to you. Under purpose, there's two fundamental types of appropriations. We have expense type appropriations for things like operations, maintenance, salaries. And we have investment type appropriations to procure capital items, real estate, ships, planes, vehicles, those sorts of things. The time dimension. Typically an appropriation has what we call an obligation period of 1 year. We have 12 months, 365 days to obligate that money. That's as long as this legal permission exists. In some cases, that obligation period is longer than a year. Our RDT&E money for research and development, test and evaluation has an obligation period of 2 years. Procurement money has an obligation period of 3 years. Construction money has an obligation period of 5 years. And this is due to the nature of the things that we're buying. Right? We can't complete the construction of a ship. We can't even do all of the contracting and modifications and those sorts of things for that ship in 1 year. And so we have 5 years during which to do all of that contracting and make all of those obligations to result in the procurement of a ship or a large building or something. And the amount characteristic, right, is defined in the appropriation. We saw in the language of that Appropriation Act a specific dollar amount, right? And that caps the amount of money that we can spend. And there are a couple of other rules dealing with amount. Whether or not the work is severable or not, a term we'll define a little later. It may determine whether or not we incrementally fund this, the amount of money needed for the current year, or whether we fully fund it, the full amount needed to acquire a useful end item, even if it takes more than a year. To illustrate this idea of an appropriation, let me use a household example. You take your son to the county fair, and your son says, "Hey, Mom, I want to go play those arcade games, right, where you throw the ring and win the goldfish or win the stuffed animal by knocking down the clown with a softball." And you say, "Okay, son, here's $10. You can spend up to $10. I only have a $20 bill, but you can only spend up to $10. You have to bring me back $10 and change. You can go play for about a half an hour and then meet me over at the roller coaster. And no spending that money on funnel cakes or cotton candy or soda. It's only for playing games. If I see you with powdered sugar around your mouth when we meet, I'm going to be angry at you. And if you're late, I'm going to be angry at you." Okay. That is the nature of an appropriation. Right? We told the child what they can do. Arcade games only, no food. We told them how much, $10, bring me back the change. And we told them the amount of time, right? You only have a half an hour with which to do this. And then appropriation works very much the same way. And we know our son is going to spend the whole $10, right? Just as we spend all of the money that we're given, because we want to maximize the benefit of that authority. And our child's going to maximize the benefit of those $10 and spend all of it. So that's one way to think of how an appropriation works. So now that we've discussed appropriations, let's turn our attention to some basic concepts of fiscal law. Those three dimensions of purpose, time, and amount that define an appropriation have been formalized in federal law. Title 31 of the U.S. Code provides for us language to help us stay within bounds, to stay within the law with respect to those purpose, time, and amount characteristics of an appropriation. There's a fourth dimension also that's important to note, and that there is statutory language requiring us to record financial information accurately within our financial systems. So let's talk about each of these statutes can be reduced into a general rule. There's lots of exceptions to these rules, but here is the general rule statement for each of those dimensions. Purpose. The purpose statute is commonly referred to as the necessary expense doctrine. And it says that an expenditure of funds from the Treasury must bear a logical relationship to the appropriation that is charged. That expenditure also cannot be prohibited by law, and it must not be otherwise provided for in another appropriation. So we have these three aspects of this necessary expense test. There needs to be a logical relationship between the thing we're buying and the appropriation that's funding it. So consider for a minute the operations of a ship. So what expenses are logically related to the appropriation for ship operations? Well, the fuel is logically related, right? Without the fuel, you can't run the ship. Spare parts are logically related. Paying the crew is logically related. The food that the crew needs to eat is logically related. The cost of electricity and sewage and water when you're pierside, garbage disposal, those things are all logically related to the operations of the ship. Second category, not prohibited by law. What we're not talking about here is that you cannot use the ship's funding to buy marijuana, right? That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is that an Appropriation Act and an Authorization Act often have limitations. An example is one that commonly appears in the Defense Appropriation Act, that anchor chain must be bought from a domestic source. So a necessary expense of operating that ship is that the ship have an anchor, and that anchor needs to be attached to the ship using a chain, okay? But if we were to buy that chain from a Japanese or Korean steel mill, that would be prohibited by law, right? So we need to make sure that we are following all of the fine print, if you will, in the Appropriation Act. And the third part of that says, cannot be provided within the scope of another appropriation. The general rule here is that a specific appropriation trumps a general appropriation. And operation and maintenance is a fairly general appropriation. We have broad discretion as to what we can do with that money. So I mentioned that the pay for the crew is logically connected to the operations of the ship. That's true. But there's a separate category in the Appropriation Act called military pay that pays for the crew. And so that is specifically provided for elsewhere in the appropriation. So we must use the military pay account rather than the ship operations account for that pay. So that's the purpose dimension in general. The time dimension of an appropriation is regulated with a rule called the Bona fide needs rule. And the Bona fide needs rule says you can use a given fiscal year's appropriation for a need that arises in that fiscal year. And in some cases, you can use that fiscal year appropriation for a need that arose prior to the fiscal year that still exists. So if you had an unfunded requirement last year, you didn't have enough money to pay for it, and that requirement still exists this year, you can use this year's money. So if I can use this year's money for this year's requirement, and I can use this year's money for last year's requirement, what can't I do? Well, I can't use this year's money for next year's requirement. So I can't buy things in advance of need. And where we tend to run into this problem is by writing contracts that extend beyond the end of the fiscal year without authority to do so, or where we buy things late in the fiscal year just to use up the money, right? When those things should have been more properly purchased. They were actually bona fide needs of the subsequent fiscal year. There are exceptions to this rule that you should be familiar with. One common one is that a one-year appropriation can buy a year's worth of service on a service contract, and that year does not need to coincide with the fiscal year. So the fiscal year runs 1 October to 30 September. I can actually fund a service contract that runs 1 January to 31 December with the current fiscal year, which means the first quarter of next fiscal year is paid for with last fiscal year's money. So the amount restriction, we often refer to the AntiDeficiency Act. The AntiDeficiency Act comes from a practice that was common 150 years ago, where branches of the government, or agencies in the executive branch typically, would overspend their appropriation and go to Congress and say, hey, thank you for the $100 million you gave us. We spent it all, and we spent another $2 million. I have these invoices I can't pay. I need a deficiency appropriation to pay for these things. Because that was evidence of a lack of discipline, and it was somewhat coercive, Congress really had to write these appropriations even if they didn't want to. They passed the Anti-Deficiency Act around the time of the Civil War that said you can't do that, right? That the appropriation limits the obligations you can create, not the expenditures. And so today we cannot obligate more than the amount specified in that appropriation. We call that the Anti-Deficiency Act. But there's multiple ways you can do that, okay? The Anti-Deficiency Act really says you can't spend money you don't have, right? One way to spend money you don't have is to spend more than you were provided. So if you were given an appropriation for $10 million and you spent $10,500,000, you have violated the Anti-Deficiency Act. You can violate the Anti-Deficiency Act by spending a legal portion of an appropriation. Okay? Call it an apportionment. We don't get all of the authority at the beginning of the fiscal year. It's doled out usually on a quarterly basis. So if you overspend what you were given in the first quarter, even though there's plenty of appropriation left, that's still a violation because you exceeded the amount that had been provided to you. Another way to violate the Anti-Deficiency Act is to obligate money before you have it. So if you write a contract the last week of September that cites next year's funding, that's improper and a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. The fourth way you can violate it is to accept what's called voluntary services, is to say ask an employee to work overtime and defer the payment of those hours until the next fiscal year. That's not proper. We incurred the obligation this year when the employee worked those extra hours, therefore we have to record the obligation this year. We can't defer that payment because we're out of money. Lastly, the recording statute says that the accounting records must accurately reflect the status of our funding, of our obligations and expenditures, that it is improper to both under-record obligations, which someone might be tempted to do if they're at risk of an Anti-Deficiency Act violation, nor can we over-record obligations, which someone might be tempted to do if they are under-executing and behind benchmarks and are worried about somebody taking their money from them. And this statute is common sense, right? We want to make sure that our leadership and those who manage the money at the macro level have accurate information. So I mentioned a couple of key terms as we talked there. I mentioned words like obligation and expenditure. So let's define some of this language. Imagine a contracting process. I've decided I want to buy something, and I need a contracting officer to buy this for me. I can't just put it on a purchase card or something. And so I send the contracting officer a statement of work. This is what I need. And I send them a funding document that says this is the appropriation that will pay for that. When I do that, I will record in the accounting records a commitment. I have committed to buy this, but the government's not yet obligated. The government's not obligated until the contract is written. And I want to record that so that I don't inadvertently obligate that money on something else in the meantime. I want to know that those funds are committed to this use. When that contract is awarded, we have what's called an obligation. The government is obliged to pay that vendor if that vendor performs. Okay. So this is the legal status that the government has put itself in. Right? We're obliged, so we're going to record the obligation. And now those funds are not available for any other use. They are set aside, right, to satisfy that obligation. When the vendor performs and is paid, when those funds leave the Treasury, we refer to that as an outlay or an expenditure. We might also say we are liquidating that obligation. All of those terms, consider them synonymous. And now money has actually left the Treasury. Right? We've satisfied that obligation. We might, for a time, have what's called an unliquidated obligation. The vendor may still be working on this project and hasn't earned the payment yet. We haven't made the payment yet. Or maybe they received a partial payment. So the contract, say, is for $1 million. They've earned half of it. We've paid half of it. We would have $500,000 expended and another $500,000 as an unliquidated obligation. So that's some of the terminology that we use when we talk about using this appropriation or exercising that budget authority. Let's think about how those authorities change over time and what our responsibilities are to manage an appropriation. So on the screen is a timeline. And our example is fiscal year 2017 Operation and Maintenance Navy money. And let's assume, although it wasn't true, that that appropriation was enacted prior to the 1st of October. So on the 1st of October, we now enter what we call the obligation period. And for O&M funding, that obligation period is 1 year. So from 1 October 2016 to 30 September 2017, we may enter into new obligations for bona fide needs that meet the definition, that match this necessary expense test, right, the purpose for O&M. And at midnight on 30 September 2017, that authority to enter into new obligations expires. And then we enter what we refer to as the expenditure period, which is not a great term because we can post expenditures during the obligation period too. So if we have a purchase that is paid for very quickly, we're both obligating and expending during the obligation period. But during the expenditure period, that is a 5-year period of time during which we still have responsibility to manage this appropriation. Even though we cannot enter into new obligations, we'll still be liquidating existing obligations. And in some circumstances, we may be modifying existing obligations. So imagine we entered into that 1-year service contract, beginning on 1 January and ending on 31 December. For October, November, and December, we are in the next fiscal year or during the expenditure period for that appropriation. And if the vendor who's providing the service is performing within the scope of the contract, but the cost is a little higher than we had originally anticipated, we may need to add money to that contract and as such modify that obligation. Or the opposite could occur. The cost is less than what we had anticipated, and we would de-obligate or remove money from that contract. So those are things that we are responsible for doing during that expenditure period, is to manage this appropriation. At the end of that 5-year period, the appropriation closes, and this is analogous to closing a bank account. Should a vendor present an invoice after that appropriation closes, we cannot liquidate that obligation using that appropriation. That account is closed. The Treasury of the United States would not recognize it as an appropriation permitting him to release funds from the Treasury, as the Constitution requires. So we would have to use a currently available appropriation. We don't want to do that, right? There's not a commanding officer in the world who wants to pay a 7-year-old bill with current money. Okay? So we have an obligation as financial managers to make sure that those accounts are clean right before those appropriations close. So if the appropriation closes at the end of the expenditure period, then we refer to that entire 6-year period as an open appropriation. So if you think about this, if you manage O&M money, you don't have just one appropriation you're managing. You have 6. You have the one that's currently in its obligation period, and you have the previous 5 that are in various states of that expenditure period. Okay? Now, we mentioned earlier, when we were talking about the time dimension of appropriations, that some appropriations have an obligation period longer than a year. R&D has a 2-year appropriation. Procurement has a 3-year appropriation, obligation period. So a procurement appropriation is open for 8 years. So if you're working in an acquisition office, let's think about this for a minute, how complicated the finances are in, say, an acquisition office. You have 8 years of procurement money. If you also had advanced procurement money for long lead items, now you have 16 different procurement appropriations. And oftentimes, initial spares are funded out of a different appropriation. For instance, the Aircraft Procurement Navy appropriation, APN 1 buys the fighter aircraft, APN 6 buys the spare parts. So if you have spare parts also, right, now you have 24 appropriations you're responsible for. Chances are you also have R&D money. That's 7 more. Now you have 31 appropriations that you're responsible for. If you have O&M money to run the Program Management Office, which is typical, that's 6 more. Right now we're up to 37 open appropriations in one office. And so knowing what the boundaries are on the use of each of those 37 appropriations, when somebody walks in the door and says, I have to spend money on this, is really important for the financial manager to know. So to summarize, this video introduced the idea of appropriations and basic fiscal law. We talked about the constitutional requirement for appropriations. We talked about the different types of appropriations, and we defined what they were. We introduced this fiscal law framework of purpose, time, amount, and the recording statute. Talked about some of the general rules that bind our behavior, that keep us under control and within the parameters of the law for our constitutional system of government to work properly, where Congress decides what we'll do and the executive branch executes. Right? But this only gave you a very surface general picture. Subsequent videos will dive into each of these dimensions, purpose, time, and amount, in a bit more detail. And we'll even talk about how the Comptroller General adjudicates questions about whether or not our actions comply with fiscal law or not.